Hey everyone, welcome to Taking the Pulse, a healthcare and life sciences video podcast. I am Heather Matthews here in the studio in South Carolina today, joined by Matthew Roberts, a Maynard Nexsen healthcare attorney who happens to be in Ohio today. Matthew, good to be with you.
Good to see you.
And we are delighted to have joining us Darcy Devine. She is a partner and founder of Buckhead FMV, which specializes in the valuation of healthcare, businesses, services, and really assets of all kind. Darcy has more than 20 years of experience serving hospitals, health systems, investors, physicians, and other providers with business and equipment appraisals, fair market value options, and physician compensation assessments. Darcy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed this podcast, so I'm glad to be on it and participate.
Thank you so much. We love to hear that people actually enjoy these conversations. So if you wouldn't mind starting us off by telling us how you got into the valuation business and why these fair market valuations are so important, particularly from a regulatory compliance perspective.
Sure. And it's kind of interesting from my standpoint. I have a very direct route into the healthcare valuation business. A lot of folks get into this and they don't know how they ended up into it, but I have a pretty direct path. So healthcare valuation, it's obviously got two different components. It's healthcare and it's valuation. The healthcare I got when I was in college. I studied at the Emory Clinic all 4 years and did administrative and tasks. And I was in business school at the same time, and so I watched and I looked at this giant organization and how it worked and all the things that had to go on behind the scenes for a physician to see a patient. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. From the valuation standpoint, I was in business school and studying finance. When I graduated, I went to work for an investment bank and lucked into a role in the equity research department, valuing healthcare stocks. So I spent a couple of years valuing publicly traded companies, the HMOs, the physician practice management companies, the kind of companies that were around in the late 90s. And I was recruited out of that environment into a boutique consulting firm. They wanted to jump on the trend of physician practice acquisitions. It was back then we didn't have as much consolidation as we do now, but the trend was happening and they wanted to get on it and they wanted somebody who could do those valuations. So that was my entree into healthcare valuation for privately held businesses. And I've been doing it now. It's actually probably over 25 years. So, and in that small little environment, I got a lot of exposure to physician compensation planning and modeling and that type of stuff. So a very direct route into healthcare valuation. In terms of why the valuations are so important, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why folks would need a valuation. One, you got an asset or a business and you don't know what it's worth. I mean, really, there needs to be some price discovery. You need to find out what this is worth before you sell it or buy it. And then there's potentially a valuation because there's a disagreement on price. Maybe you have a buyer and a seller or two owners of a company and they disagree on the value of the business or the asset. And an appraisal can come in or appraiser can come in and really help with the transaction from that standpoint. And then you've got compliance concerns. You need a valuation for compliance, and it's compliance with, in my world, healthcare regulations and healthcare laws. So we've got a lot of different government bodies, government agencies that regulate healthcare transactions, what can be paid for an asset, what can be paid for a service. And folks want a valuation to make sure that they're complying with those rules and those laws. And we come in and we assess the situation. We do all the due diligence that's needed, and we put out a document showing all our analysis, all our thoughts, and providing an opinion of value.
And I've had the pleasure of working with Darcy for almost 20 years. And because we need valuation experts and we need people that we can trust to do the valuation and stand behind them. It's just been interesting to watch the market and industry grow. And
Yes.
Darcy's been in the middle of it this whole time. So,
Yeah.
Darcy, let's talk about one specific area that we've seen a lot of growth in the development of management services organizations, or MSOs. The
Hmm.
concept's been around for a long time, but in recent years, you've seen an almost explosion of the growth in the use of MSOs. Along with that explosive growth in use, we've also seen an increase in the valuation of MSO services. And MSO services are management services provided by one party to another, usually a provider, healthcare provider, on the billing, collection, et cetera, management of the business. And you've had to do a lot more evaluation of these services. Tell us a little bit about that, this trend, and what you see in this particular area of valuation of MSOs.
Sure. And you're right. The MSO concept's been around for a long time. I just had on my desk a survey that MGMA, the source of many of our great physician compensation benchmarks and physician practice benchmarks, they used to put out a survey on MSO benchmarks. And the survey I have is from 2001.
Mm.
Um, so they haven't done it in a long time, but I mean, that's how long, it was before that too, but the MSO concept's been around for a long time. Right now, we're seeing a lot of MSO engagements or MSO related engagements because there are a lot of non-healthcare and people, investors, wanting to get in to healthcare, to invest in healthcare somehow, invest in a healthcare business. And there's state laws that prevent non-healthcare folks and companies from
Like
employing
the corporate
physicians.
practice of medicine doctrine and fee splitting, those kind of things.
Exactly. So they can't employ a doc, they can't own a medical practice, but they want to get into this healthcare business. So what we see is a bifurcation of these businesses into a clinical component and a management or an administrative component. And there's transactions between those two parts that need to be looked at from a valuation perspective. The MSOs get legal advice that the management fee that they get paid from the clinical practice needs to be at fair market value. So there's a lot of folks calling and wanting to get these management. They want to know how to structure the management fees compliantly, and then how much can those fees be? And we give opinions on that so that they can comply.
Speaking generally about opinions, could you walk us through what are the steps for getting a valuing opinion? What are the steps needed? What's the information that you need? Maybe what are the limitations?
Sure. So generally, there's a pretty standard process for starting a project with an appraiser. The first, I mean, there is some work around defining the engagement and just understanding what needs to be valued, and maybe sometimes that can be pretty difficult. What's the asset, the service that's going to be provided? Who is providing it? Who is buying it? What are what standard of value do we have to follow? What are the rules and regulations that are applicable here? Just kind of getting that all together so we understand the engagement. Um, Once that's understood and we know what we're valuing and the purpose for the valuation, we know what the intended use of the valuation is, we can put out a data request. And that's folks who've ever bought a house, they understand the data request process of you know financial data and all that type of stuff. Well, we ask for that if it's a company. We want the historical financials on the company. If we're looking at a specific physician and what that physician's professional services might be worth, we want to know uh, what that physician has done historically from a production standpoint. I mean, there's a lot of background that we want. And so we try to tailor a data request around the specific engagement and ask good questions. But that can be a big endeavor for some folks. Once we get the data, we've got to do the analysis, we've got to do the writing and the thinking, and basically that's, done back in our office. We have conversations with management, if that's needed, and that's a lot of times in a business valuation setting. We'll have conversations with management. We'll do what we need to do to form our opinion, and then we put it in a written summary. So that our reports, we're trying to follow the guidelines that we have from our different societies and the folks who are looking at or are giving us standards to follow. So there's different societies that I'm a member of, and they have requirements, rules that they want followed when an appraiser puts out a report, and so we're wanting to follow those. There's also something called the USPAP, Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, that has different requirements for reports, and we're trying to mirror those requirements in most of our reports. So that that's what we're doing when we're taking weeks to write something, if it's a pretty long report.
Yeah, and there's a lot of regulation that people don't understand for valuations that exist just in the general valuation world. But then you add the layer of healthcare valuation with additional healthcare regulatory components. It has turned into a cottage industry, frankly, and the growth doesn't look like it's slowing down any from our perspective. But Darcy, can you talk a little bit about the different valuation approaches that you use when you are looking at valuing a business or an asset versus valuing compensation paid to someone? Because those are two separate things that you do both of them. Talk a little bit about the differences and how you approach those.
Okay, well, there's three general approaches to valuation, and they apply regardless of what you're valuing. They get administered differently, applied differently, but the three, it's the income approach, and it looks at what the asset or the business or the service can generate from an income standpoint or cash flow standpoint. There's the market approach. What has this asset, business, service been sold for in recent years or over some recent period? And then there's the cost approach. If we broke the business down into components or the service down into components and value those individual components and put them back together, what would you come up with as a value? Another way to handle the cost approach is what's the replacement or the reproduction value or cost of an asset or a business or a service. But those three approaches can be used across the board. Now, they're not going to work for everything that you're valuing, and some get used more often than others for business appraisals or services appraisals. When you're valuing a business, you're going to oftentimes use the income approach or a market approach. You might not use the cost approach. When you're valuing physician services, you're a lot of times going to use the market approach because there's a lot of data on what physician services are worth, for example, and we've got benchmarks to rely on. And so when you're doing the appraisal, whatever it is, you start out knowing that these three approaches exist. You figure out, can you use one, or, is one better than the other? You're supposed to, in your report, acknowledge all of them and say why you used them or you didn't use them, and then reconcile your values if you use multiple approaches. But yeah, you're supposed to look at all three of them regardless of what you're valuing. You just can't use all of them every time for everything.
So there's a little bit more art than you would think in valuations. It's not just all science and numbers.
Definitely, yeah. You've got to there's a lot of different a lot of knowledge you have to have when you're approaching an appraisal, and knowing what's available to you from a a data standpoint, a benchmark standpoint. You've got to know when it's healthcare, you've got to know when one approach might get you somewhere that you don't want to go from a compliance concern. Sometimes, for example, the income approach isn't appropriate because the revenues generated from the asset or the service, they might not be appropriate to look at from a compliance standpoint. So you have to have a large knowledge base when you're doing healthcare valuations, and then you're picking and choosing and you're reconciling. It is a bit of an art. There's no, you do this, you use this in this situation. You reconcile 80% of this number, 20% of that number. A lot of it is up to the appraiser.
Right. The average appraiser can't do the healthcare stuff because it's so specific, so specialized.
And we know in business, not everyone agrees. Reasonable people can disagree for sure. So, Darcy, speak to how it's important for the people, your team, the valuation experts, being able to stand firm and explain their opinions when they're being investigated or they're having discussions with like a government investigator or deposition trial, something like that, and how that is part of your work as well.
Sure. And just to say something about you're going to have different people coming up with different numbers. That's absolutely true. And if you had two appraisers come up with the exact same number for something, I mean, I would wonder how that happened. Appraisers generally, if they have the same engagement and they have the same material, they have access to the same benchmarks, should come up within a reasonable degree from one another, but they shouldn't have the same answer. And as always, fair market value is a range. It is always a range. It is not a specific number. And because, two numbers just a little bit apart are probably going to be within the range. So well, ask me your question again. I'm sorry, I forgot.
No. I was just thinking about the fact that one person's opinion is not going to be the same as another, to your point, appraiser's opinion. And so then how do you handle it when you are in a trial or being part of a deposition or speaking with a government investigator? And how are you able to develop those skills into part of your practice going forward?
Sure. Well, you have to be able to defend your appraisal. So there's the best time to, I guess, walk away from an appraisal or not, if you're not going to be comfortable with what you're going to come up, is at the beginning of the assignment. First, not to accept the assignment if it's out of your wheelhouse, if you don't think it's the client's expectations are not reasonable, something like you walk away from it up front. You don't get into a position where you're going to, put something out that you can't support. Along the way, you do all the work necessary to feel very solid about your opinion. And I really feel like you should, in most time, have a pound the table feeling about your opinion. You should be able to pound the table and support it. There are limiting conditions that you can put in an appraisal as an appraiser that protect you in some ways. So a limiting condition would be, we haven't audited the data, and we expect that the data that's come to us from our clients is good data. We've gotten all the data that is impactful, and we haven't audited. So that's a reasonable limiting condition, that the client has given you the right the data or all the data. But you can't make limiting conditions that are absurd. So you can't say, well, this is the value of this business, but not on Tuesdays, right? You can't have you can't put caveat everything in your appraisal. And then you need to stand by it. Once you put that out and sign the appraisal, there's, you if there's a issue with the valuation or something like that, you handle it before you sign and put something out there. Once it's out there, people are going to depend on it, and you've got to be able to support it. An appraiser also is a person. So our industry, our standards have an appraiser signing a report. It's not a firm signing a valuation report. We sign it. If people in our firm or that we've contracted with have like substantially contributed to the valuation, they're supposed to be identified in the valuation. And if they had a really impactful, meaningful contribution, they're supposed to sign the valuation also. So this is at the individual level. You have to be able to support it. And then, I mean, things happen. I mean, there can be mistakes in evaluation. I don't know one appraiser who's hasn't made a mistake. And that happens. We're humans, right? If you have a mistake and it's been relied upon, you've got to figure out how to correct that, and talk to your client about it, be forthcoming about it. But in general, you can't back off your opinion once you put it out there and people have relied on it.
And let's talk a little bit in the final question, Darcy, about how the industry has changed in 20 years. One way I know is that some of these opinions get more scrutiny by third parties. So you write it for hospital A, and then a government or a government lawyer or a key TAM whistleblower lawyer looks at it and tries to pick it apart. And you probably didn't anticipate having to cross swords with these type of folks when you got into the valuation business, but now it's a part of the business. How else has the industry changed over the last couple of decades?
Well, the industry's changed quite a bit. I mean, when I got into it, I mean, it was HIPAA was coming into play. We had Stark 1, Stark 2, Stark 3. I mean, the IRS was starting its whole physician recruitment guideline process. I mean, when I started, it was all these things were being enacted. They weren't being enforced yet. And now we've had like a real period of enforcement, and we've got a lot more information about like what the government expects. Now we can see when there's been a settlement, a lot of times we can go and look at the complaint and see what the specific allegations were. And, that's very helpful to see what the perception of, different things in our industry is from the government's point of view. When I started, we didn't have, the internet wasn't even kind of what it is now, and we didn't have a lot of resources either. I depended on books for valuation. We had Shannon Pratt and Mark Dietrich and some other industry leaders writing books. You had to buy them, wait till they came, and then highlight.
You had to read them too. You had to read them.
Right, you had to read them. Now it's something happens, something changes. CMS makes a change on the physician fee schedule. There's 2 or 3 blog articles or same day. And there's a lot of feedback and communication about, how valuators think about stuff. So there's so much more information. But what I've also seen is that these complaints, they identify or they talk about the valuations that were done. Like it might be a factor of early on, there weren't valuations. And now a lot of these deals that are subject to complaints or, being talked about in these settlements, there are valuations, and so the valuations are being discussed. And so, as an appraiser, I always expect that first that my reports are going to be read. We write it from the standpoint that some regulator is going to read it. And we want them, we don't want to have them not to be able to follow it or have really pie in the sky assumptions or anything like that. We're writing it to explain our point of view, where we got the information, how we arrived at our opinion. So, it's a big difference. And from 25 years ago to today. And, there's so much more to work with than there was back then.
Right.
Well, in my view, that makes your assistance even more valuable because you really put in the time back before everything was so easy to access and got a good foundation. So I can see why Matthew's been working with you for all these years, Darcy.
Oh, thank you.
Darcy Devine, she is a founder and partner at Buckhead FMV. We are so grateful for you taking the time to join us today and for watching in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I hope it was helpful.
And for those of you who joined us today, we hope you enjoyed this episode. There is definitely a lot to learn in this area, so stay tuned for more topics on fair market value in the coming future with all the changes in healthcare. And on behalf of the team here, we look forward to seeing you next time right here on Taking the Pulse, a healthcare and life sciences video podcast.